great to announce the next speaker for today, Robert Pell, the founder and CEO of Minviro. And yeah, we can clap. And Robert, we know each other now since quite a few years because actually your journey was closely linked to our journey.
Yeah.
And we have come across each other quite a few times already in the past. He's got a background in geology and a PhD focused very much on responsible sourcing of rare earth elements. So it's pretty much closing also the loop to what you mentioned this morning, Roland. And I think it was also great to see how Minviro grew actually over the last couple of years. You're now supporting major clients like Tesla, Rio Tinto, Stellantis, and providing advanced LCA software, doing LCA life cycle assessments for key leaders or leading companies in the industry. And it's fair to say that you're probably with Minviro also a leading company providing very much those life cycle assessment solutions in the industry. But with that, I'm going to leave the stage to you. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Nice one. Well, thanks very much for that kind introduction. And yeah, firstly, I'd like to really thank Metals Hub for inviting me to speak today and coordinating such a great and relevant event with a really impressive selection of attendees and speakers. So I'm going to present today around, we've had a great presentation just previously on measuring the impact of specific products through specific production routes in terms of sustainability. I'm going to talk a little bit more about actually how that's done in practice, the methodology, some of the challenges around that, but also how that data can be used within environmentally informed purchasing decisions. And there's a little bit of work that we've done in collaboration with Metals Hub historically, but I'm also going to try and position sort of a vision of the future, how purchasing can really include sustainability as a performance metric within purchasing decisions. I need the clicker, so I realized I can't click through. Is that up here? Thank you very much. Otherwise, it would have been a very boring presentation on slide 1. Brilliant. So I don't really need to say much about myself because I've had such a great introduction there. But just to highlight that really the vision of Metals Hub around innovation, technology, facilitating sustainable material flows and production, that's very aligned with why I did my PhD on the topic and why I founded Minviro. In essence, I really did part of my PhD in China because that's kind of where the action was, as we've seen from the previous presentations before. But there's obviously been an historic sort of maybe concern around some of the energy transition material production in different regions and maybe sort of the externalities, the environmental externalities not being included in some of these production pathways. Just a very quick snapshot about who Minviro is. So we are a technology, consulting, and data provider headquartered in London, but we have an international presence. So I'm based in London, but we also have an office in Shanghai in China, in Perth, Australia, and also in Amsterdam. And that's really a reflection of the global nature of the sector that we serve, which is really in the energy transition. And I think we're positioned in a really unique position to have a unique view on how different parties across the supply chain perceive sustainability and what kind of data they want and the risk they see in this sector. So we both work with the upstream, so big mining and metals companies, some of those mentioned here, like Alcoa, Rio Tinto, to name a few, some of the midstream, as well as the downstream consumers of these materials. And I think what I've seen in the last few years is actually quite a big transformation, especially in the downstream companies, how they're perceiving sustainability in their supply chain. They're really extending the boundary of where they perceive risk, not just in their own manufacturing stage, but in their supply chains. And not just over one lens, like carbon is the focus, and that's a topic that I'm going to talk about today, but across a broad range of sustainability risk. Another important topic that like this whole session is around and what Minviro really cares about is technology enabling improvements in this space. Because, Minviro started as a consultancy, but we quickly realized that it's very difficult to train consultants and train people to scale to the needs of the market. And really, we need to rely on technology to do a lot of the heavy lifting in both measuring sustainability, mitigating impacts, and also using it as tools for transactions and communication. So we cover quite a few different things, and you can even see from the previous presentation from Eramet, there's even different numbers in terms of how you can calculate. So there's different methodological choices you can make. But fundamentally, when I went into sustainability, it wasn't just about measuring impact. Measuring impact is a required part of the journey to enable impact reduction. So you can't mitigate what you don't measure. So this is sort of a selection of the different offerings that we provide. It also gets a bit more complex when we introduce this sort of regulatory landscape change that we're seeing today. So many people, Europe is really very advanced in the global landscape in terms of sustainability. We see that with with sort of regulatory changes or things like the EU battery regulation, which mandates a carbon footprint for every battery over 2 kilowatt hours sold in the European market. But it also requires that every part of that value chain is considered. It also mandates where primary data is required within that supply chain. I mentioned I care about impact reduction, and that's why we support with decarbonization strategy. What's also important is we're also not naive to think that companies are going to make these environmental improvements and changes at any cost. And that's why you'll see the bottom section here, life cycle costing is a very important factor. So we try and implement the cost of the different sustainability choices that companies can make. And that can be at every stage that I talked about. So it could be at the stage of an OEM, or it could be at the stage of a mining company. So I've talked about life cycle assessment quite a few times here. It might be a novel term for people. Fundamentally, it's a process to quantify the environmental impacts of a product or process. It has its own ISO standards. You can see some of these definitions within the ISO standards themselves. But some factors that make life cycle assessment such a powerful tool or process is that it really considers the full life cycle of the production. So it considers all the upstream impacts, including scope 1, scope 2, upstream scope 3, and it can also include downstream if you want to extend that scope boundary of your study. That means it's really considering the broadest, holistic, most fair impact of the production of materials and products. It also captures a broad range of impact categories. So the output of a life cycle assessment that you might be familiar with is the carbon footprint. What is the carbon footprint of a product? But we know that the carbon footprint is just a single part of the sustainability equation. Life cycle assessment captures a broad range of environmental impact categories, and the European Commission and, some other groups have identified key impact categories. So there's 16 impact categories that are often included in a life cycle assessment study under the European methodology. And these capture things such as land use change, water-related impacts, impacts related to toxicity. And the reality is, these different impact categories can be different levels of importance for different production pathways, different materials, and different technologies. And so again, the value of life cycle assessment is that it really allows you to understand a holistic impact of a product technology, and it enables a comparison and trade-offs between different approaches. Now, in practice, it sounds quite simple. In practice, the challenge is really on data collection, being able to collect all the inventory data. So imagine I've just got a really simple example here. I don't think any LCA I've done has ever been this simple. But fundamentally, you're capturing all the data. So that could be, let's think about at a mine site. We've got to capture data on diesel consumption, maybe, explosives use, water use. We've got to think about land transformation. If there's like, a pit being open pit or underground. We also have to capture data related to any sort of atmospheric emissions. So that might be you're combusting that diesel in the truck, and so you have exhaust emissions. You need to think about any waterborne emissions. Maybe you've got some sort of waste rock or tailings facility, and you have both water consumption, but you might also have, say, metal transitions within the water coming out of systems. All of this needs to be considered. And that was just for the mining stage. Then we need to think about the additional downstream stages, such as processing and transport. Now, once you've compiled all that inventory of data, you can then reference it against a functional unit. So that basically means, okay, what's the impact of 1 kilogram of nickel sulfate if you're doing that full value chain, or 1 kilogram of ore coming out of the mine? So you have your inventory, and then that needs to be translated into all those impact assessment categories that I mentioned. So carbon, land use change per kilogram of product output, water-related impacts. And then you manage to do that for the mine, and then you need to do that for the downstream, and downstream, and downstream, and you connect it like a puzzle until you have a full value chain, which is quantified in terms of impact. So that was my PhD, just done in 5 minutes there. You're all qualified now. You can throw your hats in the air if you've got them on. So we've talked about the approach of life cycle assessment, and it's my belief that life cycle assessment is the most powerful methodology we have today to include in sustainability data for things like transactions, policy, and other sort of like frameworks, because there's consistency and clarity that it's capturing a broad range of impact categories. So there are some challenges that we see in the sector. One challenge is around the quality of data that's exchanged. So I think what we saw was a really great innovation from Eramet, and we're seeing it across, we do some work, say, with the Global Battery Alliance, and across, like, we're doing some work with different governments and downstream consumers around creating these ecosystems for data transfer from the mine, from the processing plant, down right through to the consumer. The problem is, what if there's a node within that supply chain where somebody hasn't followed the rules in terms of calculating the carbon footprint or the sustainability performance of that product? Now, that's the reason why we kind of have this infrastructure for audit. But there's also the issue that the reality is not every actor in that supply chain provides that data. And so often, downstream customers or governments are having to rely on a lot of secondary data, some databases that just exist within literature or are calculated. But if I go back to the as I see this transition changing, there is an increased amount of pressure for companies to provide primary data for the sector where they operate. I talked about technology. To solve this problem for sustainability data being transferred across the ecosystem, we need technology. We need technology like traceability solutions. We need interoperability between those traceability solutions, because we can't have every entity creating their own solution, then not talking to each other. We need to have innovative tech which makes it more accessible for different stakeholders. That's a big focus of what Minviro does, to creating a collaborative platform. We need to, interoperability connecting to other systems that enable decision-making, which is an example of where solutions need to check into systems like Metal Sub Solution. But we also need standardization. So without those consistent modeling frameworks, the outputs are kind of meaningless, and we don't understand where the hotspots are, we don't understand what can be done to reduce impact. And so what does a good digital tool, a good digital ecosystem look like? So what we need is really easy primary data collection. We need to make the barrier, the burden to collect that primary data as low as possible, the cost as low as possible. We need an integrated system that pulls together the different stakeholders. Another big concern or cost is, okay, like, what is the cost of this verification and sustainability? We need to really reduce that burden by using technology to bring that together. But we also need to provide actionable insights to drive innovation actually within the companies and within the processes themselves. More often than not, the value that our customers derive from the LCAs that we do is actually completely novel insights or considerations that they wouldn't have thought of themselves. there might be an assumption, for example, that transport is the big carbon footprint within their value chain, when actually it might be a reagent that they haven't even thought of. And actually we can drive, co-benefits of cost reduction alongside sustainability improvements. So embedding that actionable insight within technology is super important. So, I'll finish off. I've given a lot of information here, but I've just kind of got a very simple visual that I've got here about what this ecosystem, and this doesn't need to be, this is Cycle, so this is Minviro, and this is Metals Hub. Obviously, this doesn't need to be us. I'm just saying this is the ecosystem that we think needs to exist to enable sustainability data to be included in purchasing and governmental decisions. You need to have the producers which have an easy job providing primary data in the right way, in a consistent format, aligning with regulatory needs. We need data exchanges between these systems and platforms where decisions are made and transactions are made. And we need those procurement specialists to be able to have that kind of information as well that they trust. The trust is so important because, we talk about the green premium. Nobody's going to pay a green premium if they don't trust the value of the sustainability information within that system. And here's just some benefits for procurement, just at a very high level. But yeah, that's the end of my presentation, and I wanted to just finalize my talk with sort of an idea around positivity that I think that sustainability is going to be considered within a performance characteristic in the coming years as regulation becomes more evolved and adopted. And the one that I will always point towards is if we think about the EU battery regulation, at first they mandate just a disclosure of a carbon footprint, but over time they mandate a maximum carbon footprint threshold. Now, if they mandate a maximum carbon footprint threshold, there will be a material benefit to make sure that they're procuring lower impact materials. And we're starting to see that with price fluctuation, say, for example, between primary and secondary materials. So you have recycled content requirements, and you might have companies which will pay a premium under certain circumstances to stay within those recycled content requirements. I think that's also going to be true for sustainable materials. Right. Thank you very much for your time, and looking forward to questions.
Thanks, Robert. I think, as I said, we are working together since quite a number of years already. And before we jump here to questions from the audience, I just want to say also that we've made great experience actually with integrating our systems with each other. I think there is yet more to come, and we need to do more of that, integrating systems, because that's really the future. No system can actually develop this entire ecosystem themselves. So this is also our philosophy, that we always need to collaborate, work together, and making sure that people have access to the data. Which industry do you think is most advanced when it comes to LCAs?
That's a really good question. Surprisingly, the construction sector is actually quite evolved, but down a different path. So they use the language of environmental product declarations, and environmental product declarations are already quite mature within like regional regulations and construction regulations. So there is a blueprint in terms of how this scales within industry. But equally, when we're thinking about, say, the energy transition and supply chains that maybe we're more focused on, there's definitely more pressure and more sort of advanced thinking and digital solutions in the OEM space, because they are what the EU defines as the economic operator. They're the ultimate ones that have to align with the regulations, and they're the people that are requesting data from the upstream. So they're under a bit more urgency, but you'll see that will go upstream as well over time.
Okay, interesting. I didn't bet actually on the construction industry, to be perfectly honest. Well, maybe then the last question from my side: who's the worst? We don't need to shame any industry.
Well, if you're thinking about the whole industries, I mean, there is a lot of movement in loads of industries. So again, different countries have different levels of maturity, and you're seeing a lot of progress actually in textiles and in food. And actually, again, looking at the EU regulations, they have the ESPR, so Eco Design for Sustainable Product Regulation, and they identify the key materials that will require the sustainability data. So I wouldn't want to bet on who's the furthest behind, but there is a lot of incentive for many industries to come along on this sustainability journey.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
We've got a number of questions already here, but I'm also checking if anybody wants to ask a question from the audience. Otherwise, we look at some of the questions here. I think AI.
Yeah.
Are you using anything in your LCA solutions already, or are you planning to do so? I think that's also from a digitalization perspective a hugely important topic.
Yeah, for sure. It is huge, and it's impossible to avoid. Our CTO actually has a PhD in AI, and so we have that very much in our strategy. However, our firm belief is that AI should be used in the appropriate context when in this world of sustainability and life cycle assessment. So fundamentally, we want to try and encourage primary data collection, because if you're using AI to try and restructure that primary data, it's only going to rely on historic data. The reason why you need primary data is because that data doesn't exist. So AI doesn't solve that problem. AI really solves the resource-intensive stuff that doesn't need to happen. So things like regulatory alignment, data quality indicators, and report writing, and all that stuff can really drastically reduce the price of compliance and good LCA data across the value chain.
I mean, I think that goes into the direction here. What are the most major bottlenecks when it comes to actually coming up with an LCA? Where do you see in the industries that you're working problems, challenges? What is tricky actually to get?
So one of the biggest challenges is probably around data exchange within the supply chain. So there's obviously complex relationships and dynamics within supply chains. And to actually get that good quality sustainability data of that final product, you need to be able to have that data exchange through each stage of that supply chain. And often a midstream or a mining company might not want to say exactly what their carbon footprint is or what the inventory items they're consuming are. So managing that and making sure that IP or sensitive information isn't shared, but the required sustainability data is shared with compliance, I would say that's the biggest challenge.
Okay. I think that's something that we can perfectly relate to. What do people want to share and what do they not want to share when they're exchanging information with counterparts? I think one of the key points, you studied in China, or part of your journey was in China, because that's where everything plays out. What kind of visibility do we have actually for China? People normally believe, or many people believe, China is actually not very far advanced when it comes to the topic of sustainability. We've seen different examples there. Do you see other regions that are actually lacking behind, or is it China in this space?
I think, so my view on this is that when in the West, we tend to look at China as a black box, when the reality is China is the biggest market in many of these sectors, and so they typically will probably have the worst sustainability performers and typically some of the highest performers as well. You know, there are, like for example, some of the largest battery manufacturers, like CATL, for example, they've got a climate neutral commitment to every one of their facilities. It doesn't mean their batteries are climate neutral, it means their facilities are. But there are differences even within China. I would say that China has kind of stepped up and filled the void as the US has stepped back from sustainability. You've seen President Xi make public commitments for the first time about climate targets, and you're starting to see policies get deployed quite quickly, and we have an office in China. We work with a lot of Chinese supply chain actors. There is things that you have to do different, and that data sensitivity is an even bigger thing in China, especially if you're an international operator working in China. But it's definitely not ignored.
Okay. I think then one last question, looking at the time. CBAM.
Yeah.
What's your view on that? Is it trustworthy, actually, all the data that are uploaded there? Does it work?
So I fundamentally think CBAM is a very good idea. Where I can understand, this kind of links to the other question that we see up here around sort of the backtracking of some of the European regulations. And my view is there just needs to be broader alignment with policies. Like, CBAM has a completely different methodology than LCA. It kind of has some, in my view, arbitrary exclusions. So it follows like the ETF trading methodology. So just to give you a high-level context, for example, if something's on wheels, then you wouldn't include the carbon emissions from that. So, and that's just one example. It has a few other things, which is like where the calculation's excluded. So I think harmonization of how you calculate stuff would be a massive benefit for everybody, because they wouldn't need to do multiple different models. But ultimately, I think it is a really good way of encouraging investment in decarbonization. And on the data, is the data trustworthy? It depends, because at the moment it's acceptable to use secondary data in many instances, and secondary data, as I said, is just database data. And the reality is, like, I'll just give you an example of nickel sulfate. We've done a public report where, depending on how you produce nickel sulfate in which technology in which region, you can have a ratio of 20 times the higher carbon footprint per kilogram than the lower one. And we know that the sort of existing databases out there aren't necessarily representative. So again, I would really encourage primary data, like facilitating primary data collection is what we need to do, rather than relying on secondary data.
Good. Cool. With that, Robert, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We'll continue our collaboration.
Yes.
So
thank you very much.
This is for you.
Yes.